Thank you so much. I have to stand here, and my tendency is to wander about and throw my arms in the air, so I shall try and resist doing that. Giving the Rhind lectures is a tremendous privilege, and I'm very grateful to the Society, to its president, to its director, and all the fellows for inviting me. And I'm also extremely grateful to you for coming to hear them. We're all very busy, much too busy. I have a job today, doing my emails, Facebook, Twitter, I have to do my tweets, the BlackBerry is playing up. And as for academia.com, don't ever go near that, because it throws up a message 4 or 5 times a day saying, what are you thinking right now? And you start typing in, I hardly like to tell you, but you don't put nothing, because then your 75 people who are following you on academia.com will know the truth. Now, my purpose in these lectures is to persuade you all that it is field archaeology, not theory, which is the basis for our discipline. And that the basis for field archaeology is not technique, but design. I also want to offer you a vision of a world where this might be so. I have in mind as my main audience the people who I and other lecturers have been teaching at university, and who leave university and go into the commercial sector, where they are paid to do archaeology. These are some of the most talented people who pass through the universities, and the way that they can express themselves archaeologically is severely limited. So I thought I would address this topic. I thought I would invite you to come with me on a little excursion where there will be lots of polemic, and I hope that we will be able to argue together. I see there are 3 microphones here, so if we wanted to have another try-wizard contest, as people do nowadays, if they want to elect a leader or whatever, we could do that. We could all shout at each other. That's absolutely fine with me. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll have a song to break the ice.
Archaeology is an art, it's not a science. Archaeology is an art, it's not a science. Archaeology is an art, it's not a science.
You can join me if you wish.
You don't go whole a mile deep without a context plan. You don't go whole a mile deep without a context plan. You don't go whole a mile deep without a context plan. And you ain't gonna dig no more. Archaeology is a science, not an art. Archaeology is a science, not an art. Archaeology is a science, not an art. And you ain't gonna dig no more.
He drank a bottle of whiskey and interpreted the sight.
He drank a bottle of whiskey and interpreted the sight. He drank a bottle of whiskey and interpreted the sight. And you ain't gonna dig no more.
All together now.
Archaeology is a science, not an art. Archaeology is a science, not an art. Archaeology is a science, not an art. You ain't gonna dig no more.
Well, my thanks to the York Harmonious Warblers for that rendering. And by the way, your soloists tonight were Steve Roscombs and Kate Giles. Now, let's just consider this vexing text of this immortal hymn sung round 100 campfires at 1,000,000 digs. Is archaeology an art or a science? If we pay a visit to the ancestors, we find that they didn't know either. In the 1930s in America, Alfred Kidder summed it up in these immortal terms. I like this quote very much. The details of archaeology are in themselves so interesting that it is fatally easy to become completely absorbed in them. And there's always the excuse that without close and accurate work, one cannot arrive at trustworthy conclusions. The result is that too often one arrives at no conclusions at all. It is quite as fatally easy to ignore detail with the plausible excuse that the close worker cannot see the forest for the trees and strike out blithely on the primrose path of speculation. Well, in this country, of course, we're more inclined to pay attention, or pay homage, really, to Pitt Rivers as our first ancestor and the so-called father of archaeological science. Pitt Rivers, not without a little whitewashing, claimed empirical purity. Every detail should be recorded in the manner most conducive of reference. It ought to be the chief object of an excavator to reduce his personal equation to a minimum. But this was quickly shown to be impossible by Flinders Petrie in a very fine book, which hardly anybody reads these days, Aims and Methods, or Methods and Aims in Archaeology. The old saying that a man finds what he looks for is too true. It is at least true that he does not find anything that he does not look for. To state every fact about everything found would be useless. It would be like a detective who would photograph and measure every man on London Bridge to search for a criminal. Now, listening to these two versions, one can't help noticing that for us it is Petrie who comes across as the modernist, aware that the personal equation is what drives the inquiry. Eliminate it, or pretend to, and you can eliminate the business of archaeology altogether. Well, as we all know, Mortimer Wheeler, seen here with a young Barry Cunliffe, praised Pitt Rivers and installed him as a role model. But he was hostile and dismissive of Petrie. My choice of topic for these lectures was prompted by a lifelong wish to reflect on field archaeology before an informed audience, but also a realization that Mortimer Wheeler's influential Archaeology from the Earth, published in 1954, emerged from his own Rhind lectures, given more than half a century ago. At that time, he reminisced over his previous 30 years in the field. So in some ways, this is not a bad moment to take stock, to do something a bit similar, see how well his adages have survived and how many of his predictions came true. We will see that an enormous amount has changed. I only met Wheeler once, not long enough to have an argument with, but we were both in the army and both born in Glasgow, so I feel the argument would have been a good one. Wheeler is associated with a number of strong opinions. He admired Pitt Rivers, but perhaps this was because, as a general, an ex-general, Pitt Rivers outranked him. He denigrated Petrie, describing his brilliant methods and aims of 50 years earlier as quirky. And he took him to task for delegating supervision, claiming that his pen melts as he thinks of Petrie's absenting himself from the site. But at least Petrie was away engaged in fieldwork. Here is Noel Meyer's recollection of Wheeler at Brecon Gare. Quote, Rick, i.e. Wheeler, Rick himself treated the excavation as the agreeable background to a fishing holiday. He would begin the day by directing Christopher, that's Hawkes, and myself of what we were to find, and then disappear in the direction of the river. In the evening he would return, not always overburdened with the trophies of the chase. He would listen to what we told him of the day's work on the dig, and then explain to us what he thought it meant. Wheeler was thus not prevented by his own failings from condescendingly painting Petrie as part of a whole Near Eastern catastrophe which had somehow evaded Rick's organising baton. Now, we shall have to take a look at this particular prejudice. Wheeler advocated a box method of excavation and adroitly managed to promote his system as the option of the open-minded. At the start of his Rhind lectures, he famously said, "There is no right way of digging, but there are many wrong ways." I've heard on many occasions archaeologists repeating this dictum to each other with evident satisfaction. And it was a saying typical of a man regularly intoxicated by his own aphorisms. This one, unfortunately, means nothing. If there are no right ways and many wrong ways, then the ones that aren't wrong aren't right either, which leaves us roughly where we were before. Clearly, what he actually intended to say was, there are many wrong ways of digging, some of them truly ghastly, especially Petrie's, and only one right way, mine. I trust I make myself clear. His emphasis on neatness, however, was right on the button. In the famous propaganda picture reproduced here on the right, he distinguished between the good order and military discipline of a well-drilled Wheeler excavation with the mayhem of the Middle East. There were plenty of other examples of mayhem. This is presumably what he had in mind, and the death trap on the right there is one of Petrie's. But this is equally horrible, perpetrated at Caerleon by Victor Nash Williams, described by Wheeler in Still Digging as one of his star students. But the point is well made all the same. Without particular standards of neatness, excavation is not only pointless, but misleading. Petrie actually believed this too, and said on the first page of his 1904 book, "Spoiling the past has an acute moral wrong in it." A good example of our own time is Ötzi, the Iceman, first excavated with ski sticks, and then more carefully planned and excavated and analysed, but with a certain image in mind. A Bronze Age mountaineer, fleeing his enemies, is shot down and left for dead. He did seem to be carrying an enormous amount of equipment, but no one wanted to ruin a good story, until this year at least, when a group of Italian scholars showed that Ötzi was actually a furnished inhumation burial, with a very different role in history, if only it had been excavated as such. We can note that in spite of Wheeler's excellent lead, excavation has got no less messy. Here are 4, all from Europe. I'm tactful enough not to identify them, but they're all photographed within the last 3 years. Neither is Britain immune. Weekly on television, we see sights to make you blush, and the Wheeler pen would really be justified in melting. Why is this? Is it a lack of lofty power brokers ready to boom disapproval? Is it a weakness of temperament? Is it the end of national service? What actually makes the difference between a good excavation and a bad one? Or is everything just relative? As a first step on the quest, it might be worth paying a brief visit to the land of archaeological sin, as Wheeler dubbed the Middle East, just to see whether there is something inherently chaotic in the region, in the water or in the air. Of course, there are plenty of examples of extravagant grubbing out of antiquities, but this is not unique to the region. And where tombs are large and rich, there will be robbing on a scale to match. On the positive side, let's first remember Claudius Rich, diplomat and flute player at the beginning of the 19th century. Long before Layard pillaged Nineveh, or what he thought was Nineveh, or Schliemann quarried Troy, or what he thought was Troy, Rich visited Babylon and carried out the first evaluation using a surface survey and old quarry pits. He stole nothing and made a topographical model of the buried town. At the same place, at the end of the same century, Robert Coldaway was carrying out well-organised area excavations on a huge scale for the Berlin Museum. He was the first, as far as I can make out, to put his excavators in a troweling line. Long before the middle of the 20th century, the principal objective of most excavators was not the retrieval of antiquities or even the exposure of a great monument, but the historical sequence from the very earliest years, as Petrie did at Abydos or Kathleen Kenyon at Jericho. These sequences, lest we forget, created most of prehistory before radiocarbon dating. Of course, they strove to make links with the Bible and Homer and so on, I know all that. But even so, it was a tremendous achievement, laboriously sequencing pottery and palaces, temples and towns, work which remains of permanent value, however much later corrected in detail. Naturally, this kind of digging requires deep and narrow areas and the carrying of much spoil many metres upwards. The workforce was not always totally disorganised. It was generally marshalled and ranked and divided into small teams like platoons, each led by a pickman, assisted by a spademan, and served by basket boys. The procedure was determined by the stuff. The stuff was hard, full of mud bricks, some broken, some still in situ. A pick was needed, but an intelligent pick, using accurate force. These tools are still needed and still in use, as are the basket record sheets. This is from a 2009 publication. Clearly, there are factors here to do with the type of strata, and these factors have remained valid. In colonial times, the workforce was predominantly local, and the officer class predominantly imperial, British, French, German, Italian, or American, of course. But cool operators like Leonard Willey prized their foremen and encouraged the upwardly mobile through a graded pay structure. In fact, it is arguable that the workforce at had rather less to complain about than the 21st century British contract staff we encounter in Paul Everill's PhD thesis, The Invisible Diggers, of which more tomorrow. Disaffection there was, of course, but it was local and not endemic to the century, which those alive at the time could hardly escape. It seems that more human disruptions were at work. Max Mallowan's memoirs describe in graphic detail the pleasures and excitements of exploring ancient Mesopotamia and leave the reader in no doubt that excavation is an emotional business. As second in command at he was able to observe Leonard Willey at first hand and learn from his ability to find tombs collaboratively with the locals, who knew them rather well. He also observed at first hand the sensationally beautiful and irredeemably awkward Catherine Willey. In his memoirs, he tiptoes over her reputation as over broken glass, but we are left with no doubt that she was exasperating, willful and demanding, and Willey was at her beck and call day and night. When Max wanted to get married, he realised that he would lose his job at her, since Catherine would tolerate no other woman on the site. Mallowan married Agatha Christie, whom he'd shown round the excavations, and who was to enjoy a delicious revenge. Catherine appears thinly disguised as Louise Leitner in Murder in Mesopotamia, where she's described as charming, with a blonde Scandinavian fairness, with lovely violet eyes, but a dangerous woman who caused quarrels. She's duly murdered, to the author's evident satisfaction, with a list of suspects that included practically everyone on the dig, at least everyone who belonged to the murdering classes. To the amazement of all except her, Poirot, the murderer is none other than the adoring Dr. Leitner, her long-suffering husband. This picture also shows the dig house at the fictional Tel Yarinja, more or less the same design as that built at Chattelhoyk seen on the right, although I'm not suggesting any other resemblance. Agatha Christie continued helping on excavations and in the potshed long after she was rich and famous, and she wrote a loving account of archaeology in Come, Tell Me How You Live, which provides a lively sketch of the stresses of getting a dig house built and a dig going and trying to satisfy the sponsors at home and the authorities of the country whose guests they were. One passage in Mallowan's memoirs describing his first encounter with Tel Jidal epitomises the enchantment that so many of us feel when embarking on a new project. I have rarely seen a more delectable and beautifully situated spot. It was a compact mound with steep slopes, standing to a height of 15 metres, and it covered about 4.5 acres in all. The top of the mound directly overlooked the crystalline blue waters of the river which were transparent right down to the bed and teeming with fish. The banks were lined with a few willow trees, and the only presence of human occupation was a small house which belonged to a lonely miller who ground wheat and barley, brought to him by people in this district. How devoutly I hoped that this mound would turn out to be a good one. We could have happily settled down here for several years. Sadly, it didn't, but this first step into the deserted garden is something we can all relate to. So are the personal stresses of a dig community, the local economy, the vicissitudes of the strata. If we want to know why excavations look different from place to place, maybe we should be digging a little bit deeper. So before we join in the chorus of boos, we can note that the people who Wheeler ranted at were not all bad and achieved much. In my judgment, they were applying their objectives to the kind of strata they had to deal with in the society they were in, and these are important themes for me. But let's park them to one side for the present and look at another of Wheeler's dogmas, the shape of an excavation. His box system was intended primarily for the greater control of an unskilled workforce. Each excavator's downward itinerary being tracked by the sections on the walls of their box. As everyone knows, Wheeler liked to see women in his boxes, thus combining various pleasures of the chase. My picture also includes an extract from the acknowledgements in the Maiden Castle report. You may notice a certain theme running through that. Now, happily, not everyone reads this situation in my unworthy manner. The modern-day website, archaeologyexpert.com, hails Wheeler as a pioneer feminist. Ladies to the rescue, it says. Wheeler's box system was adopted out of his respect for women, which is true in a manner of speaking. Of course, we're not here to condemn the rewards of the unintended consequence. The box system is still widely practiced in India and particularly in China. Here it would seem to bring the same kind of benefits of social control as that at Maiden Castle, perhaps not the same, but similar. And my picture shows an excavation that took place in 2006. Among Wheeler's predictions for the future, which he gave at the end of his Rhind lectures, were the arrival of total excavation. Quote, "We need the careful uncovering of a whole cemetery," he says. And another was the demise of the test pit. "The age of the sondage is now in large measure past." Well, the first of these quickly became true in the 1960s with the age of Martin Biddle and Phil Barker, both inspired by the Danish innovations of Goodman Hatt and Axel Steensberg. Barker was appalled by the trenches he found dug through the Roman site of Roxeter and declared himself an enemy of the trench. He realised that they'd been dug by researchers looking for sequence in the manner of the damned sinners of the Middle East. He saw this as impatient, selfish, damaging. A site should be taken apart as it had been put together, layer by layer, stone by stone. Wanting to know something was no excuse for a mode of digging. Everything except stratigraphic area excavation was a shortcut, as wrong-headed as driving faster in order to get to a petrol station before you ran out of petrol. The new banner of stratigraphic area excavation marched boldly through England and made several attempts to cross the Channel. And, when proving unsuccessful, the stratigraphic army confined itself to hurling abuse. In the 60s and 70s, impressionable young British students were told that there were few more sinister practices to be encountered on the continent than the German Schnitt, the slicing of strata into arbitrary cubes, something which sounded not so much like a loss of one's senses as an irreversible loss of manhood, as in I've opted for the Schnitt. But like everything else, this procedure has its rationale. It may have started as a control mechanism, since in the post-war years, large-scale rescue projects made use of prison labour, for example. Or it may have had some of its roots in the fact that sites on the loess, for example, are not stratigraphically strong. Layers are often invisible. But it also had a scientific rationale, which is less well known. The Schnitt or Planum method depends on horizontal and vertical surfaces meticulously cleaned and recorded exactly as they are, with or without visible layers. No one makes anything up. It is for the analysts at a later date to reconnect this three-dimensional geometry into consecutive stratigraphic episodes. Thus, its protagonists would maintain that they are not ignoring stratification, but recording it more precisely, and in a manner that is checkable. For this reason, they feel anxious about individuals removing strata in single contexts, a practice which the British promote with an almost religious fervour. The single context method enjoyed a vogue in late 20th century Britain, especially in towns and especially where there was sufficient money to employ a skilled, or at least a dedicated workforce. The context itself was an idea invented by Max Foster at York in 1972 as a general term for a stratigraphic unit, whether layer or interface or hole or bunch of stones. Pro forma recording context on a separate sheet was developed by Sue Hurst at Maudsley Abbey. The record was extended, notably by Steve Roskams at Molas, to include the pre-excavation plan of each context on a single sheet, thus single context planning. This made it easier to recall the order of deposition and in some ways answered the criticism of the Schnitters, since the perimeter of one context ought to be corroborated by the others. The order of deposition was represented on a stratification diagram, of which by far the most successful, but not the only version, was the Harris matrix. This represented the sequence as a number of boxes connected by horizontal and vertical lines. These were valuable developments, and it meant that many participants could dig and record independently and so contribute directly to the build-up of a large model of the total sequence. They could, in effect, feel like scientists, putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle, the virtues of which were self-evident. Unfortunately, the single context system, combined with area excavation, rapidly became the new dogma. Anyone not so practicing was deluded, old-fashioned, and probably had capitalist leanings. The faithful remain convinced they are right. In 2004, Richard Greatorex reported breathlessly, archaeologists in both France and Belgium have now adopted the Harris matrix on their excavations. Although it might be too early to talk of an integrated European recording system, use of the Harris matrix appears to be growing in an increasing number of countries and may eventually be adopted throughout the continent. How strange that for all this evangelical reverence, the package still remains confined to a rather narrow base, both ethnically, British, economically, well-funded, and typologically, urban excavations. What kind of insecurity, what fear of originality drives people to hold to such narrow prescriptions? It is one thing to swear by a WHS trowel, quite another to tell people that there is only one way to use it. It may be that due to a glitch in archaeological history, an isolated group of Britons are using the term context recording or Harris matrix as a nickname for stratigraphic excavation, something which has been around very much longer. But even stratigraphic excavation is not the only way of making history. Wheeler's second Shaw prediction, the end of the test pit, has not come true at all, even in England. The test pit is now probably the most common method of excavation worldwide and dominates archaeology in America. Furthermore, the pits are mostly dug by planum, by Schnitt, or as they call it there, arbitrary level or unit level. One reason for that is that strata are often hard to see. Here is the most widely used US manual, now in its 7th edition. Quote, "The unit level method is undoubtedly the most common method of excavating sites that show little stratigraphic variation." Another reason is theoretical. Anthropologists of the 1960s, famously Louis Binford, regarded the archaeological deposit as a fossilised social system. And, like a modern community, the scientific way to interrogate it was via samples. The main instrument used by social scientists is the sample questionnaire. Get enough of them filled in, review the collected data statistically, and bingo, you discover that a significant number of vegetarians play Scrabble. In archaeological fieldwork, the sample was a square metre randomly placed, either applied to material lying on the surface or dug as strata in the form of an excavated test pit. This was used both to explore a buried community as a research project or to check out a piece of land that was to be disturbed. Now, checking out a piece of land that's going to be disturbed by the CRM response allows a 15% random sample to be representative of the whole occupation. This scientific or social scientific approach was known colloquially as the new archaeology or as processual archaeology, as its objectives were to examine the processes whereby systems changed. Binford knew that the key to the execution of fieldwork was to have a design. While Wheeler had set the tone by his advocation to have a plan, Binford wanted the plan to demonstrate itself worthy of the objective, a plan which stated which data were to be recovered and subjected to which analyses, with which end in view. Binford was sure that he was doing science, and his many students and followers have remained sure of it. Here's Patty Jo Watson restaking the claim in 2007. The core of Americanist archaeology today is still new archaeology, revised and modified by practitioners and critics to take its place within archaeological thought around the world. The single contexters and the new archaeologists continue to yearn for an integrated, unified discipline with common goals and methods worldwide. We want to be like geology, like chemistry. We want to recover data and store it up. We want the results of fieldwork to mean the same wherever we are, in whichever period. Keith Kintyre's comments in 2006 are typical. Quote, "It is imperative that the development of a cyber infrastructure for archaeology begin immediately." Hope you will agree. He says, "There is a pressing need for an archaeological information infrastructure that will allow us to archive, access, integrate and mine disparate data sets." And here's Binford himself. In 2007, "The past is not a sick patient in need of diagnosis. It is a segment of a diverse and highly variable structured system, variously preserved in the present." He takes issue with Brian Fagan, who had somewhat fatuously wanted universities to focus their syllabi on cultural resource management of the present day, rather than the rediscovery of the past. Binford says, "Giving up scientific goals for legislated goals with no practical developmental research strategies carried from one project to another is not the path of the future archaeology." A better response to Fagan would be that we do not need to reduce academic training, but we should instead abandon the non-productive, eclectic, humanistic approach to the education of all archaeologists. Now, in this clunky passage, the eclectic, humanistic elephant in the room that Binford is trying to heave out is postmodernist archaeology, as promoted by Ian Hodder in Cambridge and now developed from his new base at Stanford University. Just as processual archaeology developed from anthropology's search for social evolution, so archaeology took its next stage from anthropology's development of structural, symbolic and reflexive ideas. When an indigenous subject was asked a question by an anthropologist, the answer might well be mischievous, imaginary, or what they thought you wanted to hear. In any case, it wasn't data. After Levi-Strauss, this prompted closer attention to critique. After Jacques Derrida, it moved to the deconstruction of the interlocutor. Why did they say what they said? What was the motive behind the untruth? This mapped easily onto archaeological ideas of agency and structuration, discovery of the motivation behind tombs, buildings and monuments. The path followed by Shanks, Tilley and Hodder led easily enough into current anthropological anxieties about the colonial nature of scientific characterization itself. Even where they were promulgated, the versions of the past released by traditional peoples demanded respect, as did their own territories and customs. Multimodality is the replacement of a single synthesis or model with multiple strands of interpretation. Reflexivity, the recognition that just as we discover motivations behind the narratives of others, so we need to be aware of similar tendencies towards preferred styles of tale-telling in ourselves. This approach has much potential to influence modern fieldwork. Ian Hodder certainly thinks so, and has offered us a case study in Çatalhöyük and a homily in his Archaeological Process, that's the name of his book. Its impact has been very uneven, probably due to factors that are due to be given an airing this weekend. Some aspects of his doctrine, such as recording the recording, were already widely practiced, though probably not widely known. Other desirables, like permanent specialist presence on site, were dependent on a particular kind and level of funding. Others definitely need to be challenged, like the lack of a published project design, and they will be. However, on a visit to Çatalhöyük, one is gladdened to find a very well-founded and well-managed research excavation, expertly directed by Şahina Farid, you see on the left here. And that is to say, in spite of all the theorizing claims that have been made, the excavation methodology is conventional, hierarchical, and tightly controlled. The age-old ding-dong about whether archaeology is an art or a science has been largely captured by the academic sector, who have made it into a debate about theory and the nature of reasoning and interpretation in particular. This is a pity. All subjects wrestle with this kind of self-definition, so obviously we must too, but it doesn't make us special. What makes us special is what we do, and what we do that no one else does is field archaeology. My mission in these lectures is to install field archaeology, archaeological investigation, as the central axis of our subject. What we do in the field is not a recreation for university vacations. It is the basis of the syllabus and the source of virtually all the jobs. For this reason, we should take it seriously. My way of doing this is to elevate the whole practice into something creative and original and life-enhancing. We're not analysing the past or reading it. We're writing it, and we do this through design. Well, I came to this viewpoint as a result of my own experience of fieldwork. Well, I admit this is quite limited, and that I came to it relatively late in life, but it was potent nonetheless. So let me try and explain. When I came to field archaeology, ex-army, in 1971, There were three main emphases in active theory. This is me, by the way, on the right there. And that's a ferret. That's an armoured car. This is the kind of thing we had in Aden and Borneo. Very nice. Hardly any springs. Called a ferret because it ferreted things out. I think that's why it's called a ferret. Anyway, when I arrived as wet behind the ears and started digging, I encountered these three main emphases: anthropological, historical, and empirical. And there were three main kinds of excavation layout: pit, box, and area. And there were three main ways of dissecting the strata: slicing it, lifting it by defined context, or using a mixture of the two. I was taught that these had replaced each other in some kind of evolutionary sequence. But I was soon to find out that this was a highly Anglo-centric view of the world. All these methods were still active, still promoted somewhere with equal passion. Why was this? Where was the still point in this turning world? In the précis of my digging life that follows, I've spared you many details, although, I have to say, I don't believe anyone has had such an interesting time as I have. I've stuck to a thread of examples, each of which opened a window or two on field method and taught me a little bit about why other people do what they do. I should explain that I was educated at military colleges, at Sandhurst when I was 17 and Shrivenham when I was in my late 20s. At Sandhurst I learnt SMEAC, the mantra of the troop leader. That's it there: situation, mission, execution, administration, communications. You had to have a plan. This is where Wheeler got it from, of course. And the plan had parts to it, each worked out in great detail. We spent a lot of our time writing plans. The Duke of Wellington famously said, "No plan survives the first hour of battle." Very helpful comment from a general. So why have a plan? Why have a precise, logical, controlled procedure for an activity that actually depends on 1,000 chance encounters and individual responses? I'll leave that hanging for the moment, but the parallel with archaeological excavation is perhaps closer than we think. My academic education at Shrivenham was in maths, which gave me a tendency to put everything into sets. And in chemistry, a discipline which required you to declare your aims and methods and record carefully in the lab the changing signals of something you never got to see. These are hard practices to lose, even if you become a historian or a writer. My first experience of excavation was in 1971 at Winchester, which was in moped distance of where we then lived. Having spent a week mending windows of the old school at Lower Brook Street, I was invited with a handful of other volunteers to work with Martin Biddle at the Roman South Gate, which survived as a large, impenetrable pair of mortared flint piers refurbished in the 10th century by King Alfred. I found Biddle a most inspiring companion, troweling, searching, chatting away about the layers as we tried to define them, referring to them, as was the fashion in those days, by nicknames often associated with food: the sickly grit, the nutty crunch, the Dundee cake, and so forth. These were later recorded in more sober language and drawn with precision, but what I want to remember out loud, in the light of later theorising and moralising, is the equable and affable nature of the almost continuous sharing of ideas, and this from a very senior operator, often criticised in my hearing for his commanding attitude. Also in moped range in 1971 was the excavation at Charlton, where Peter Adamon and David Lee stripped the thin topsoil from the surface of the chalk. In comparison to Winchester, this was children's archaeology. We brushed the chalk carefully until little grey spots appeared on the surface, and then sprinkled them with water. At this point, the spots went black and turned into a post-hole building which could be clearly seen and photographed from the top of a tower. I wasn't a bit surprised to note that our methods and records were quite different to those of Winchester. Of course, It was a different kind of site, both now and in the past. I would no more have expected the same plan of attack for a farmhouse in Picardy and a swamp in Malaya. Peter took me to York with him and gave me my first break, the supervision of the excavation of a car park at St Mary Bishop Hill Senior, where I grew lock hair, and in accordance with the Barkerian ethos of the day, the site was to be excavated piece by piece, every part earning equal attention, but confining ourselves to the deposit that was going to be destroyed by developers. The site turned out to be a 19th century theodolite factory, dug into a mass of medieval pits, which had largely dug away a Roman townhouse. The dissection of this mass of interleaved layers at one at a time would take years rather than the months we had. This was in 1973, and the context card was in the ascendant, so we filled them in. But I always found it almost impossible to dig without interpreting, i.e. wondering what I was looking at. I enjoyed playing I Spy and Botticelli, just like everyone else, but just trying and periodically interrupting the game to fill up a context card was not my idea of digging. It didn't amount to investigation. Duty done to the standard recording system, I would sit for hours with my A4 black book, making sketches and diagrams and dreaming about what it might all mean. This turned out to be rather useful. For reasons never adequately explained, the York Archaeological Trust managed to lose all the plans and context records of Bishop Hill Senior, and the site had to be written up from my black book, plus a TypeScript report I did before departing, and the principal section that I caused to be drawn right through the site. Now, that doesn't make pro forma recording wrong, but it did convince me that throwing away the black book, i.e. the recording of the recording and the recording of the changing interpretations, was a bit premature. I also felt that we would have spent our time and money better had we known what to expect in advance and cut our cloth according to what we wanted to know and the means we had available. This was the first stirring of what was to become evaluation. I went on to develop it over the next few years at Durham and in the West Midlands and in Italy and in France. I knew that Martin Biddle had introduced a similar kind of selectivity at Winchester, but that was in a research project in which the undug places were not going to be destroyed. At Sandler Street in Durham, I tested all 4 areas available, settling on the area under the old theatre. It smelt like wet blankets and proved indeed to be wonderfully preserved. Faced with posts with birch bark still on, with midden heaps containing old shoes and wattle buildings, I recognised that simply to turn strata into contexts was a quite inadequate way of recording it. Necessary, but not sufficient. It seemed to me that while every stratigraphic unit should be recorded as a context, there were sets of contexts that had a more advanced meaning. A well was a set of its cut, its lining, and whatever was in it. I called this higher level entity a feature. I also decided there were sets of features which belonged together, like the post hole buildings at Charlton. I called this even higher level entity a structure. An archaeological deposit could therefore be resolved into contexts, some sets of which could be resolved into features, which in turn could sometimes be resolved into structures. Each was a set of the others. I then put these different entities into a diagram which showed the sequence. Now, this may seem to you rather innocuous and rather sensible, and did to me too, but it caused a great deal of hostility, particularly amongst the commercial fraternity. This diagram itself became such a provocative issue with champions of the Harris matrix, not least Ed himself, whom I wasn't to meet until the following year, that I think I'll have to revisit it and see where it now sits in the general way of analysing strata. I will hope to convince you that when all is said and done, these are just diagrams, not magic spells, only useful insofar as they achieve what they intend to achieve. Meanwhile, in the West Midlands, I learnt that town sites are different from each other, even in the same town, and I went on learning the same lesson in work done for the French and Italian governments. I noted that there was a relationship between the topography of a site, the base material on which it stood, and the strata that formed and survived. When an excavation happened, I saw that the research dividend, as we started to call it, could be maximised with the use of recovery levels, different degrees of digging and recording to match different tasks and different objectives. Therefore, the information we retrieved from an archaeological site was really a function of how hard we looked, as Petrie had said. I had plenty of opportunities to point this out to Phil Barker in the 1970s, since I shared an office with him. He maintained, with unfailing courtesy, that I couldn't be more wrong. If you looked from the top at a perfectly clean surface, everyone would see the same thing. If every excavator were to see something different, our subject would not exist. The prescription was perfectly clean surfaces. Well, I agreed with the clean surfaces, but reminded him how Hope Taylor had seen different lines on the surface of the gravel at Yevering, depending on how long ago it had stopped raining. There's an optimum, and it is determined by us how we had cleaned, how long we had waited, how hard we had looked. Barker was right that immaculate cleaning is essential, but that's not all you do. There is an evaluation stage which tells us how the archaeology survives in the ground, and a strategy stage which tells us what we have to do to see it. Since what we see depends on how hard we look, an archaeological investigation is not only determined by its terrain, but by its objectives. What we want to know structures how hard we look, which determines what we see. Well, if this has become rather abstract, and it won't be, we'll be revisiting various of these matters as I try to put my argument together, and if you don't agree, don't worry, I never convinced Phil Barker either. I do have one more significant memory from my potted biography, however, and then we can review the position. From the 1970s, perhaps in nostalgia for my army days, I became convinced that there was a staged procedure for fieldwork, the thing I now called field research procedure. These stages had different purposes, and each one led to the next, like the plan and execution and reporting of a battle. By the time that I was asked to do Sutton Hoo in 1982, this seemed to me to be a good way to do research projects as well. And I asked my employers, the Sutton Hoo Research Trust, for 3 years to put together a fully costed project design. Amazingly, they agreed. This design matched the terrain, that is the archaeology surviving in this pillaged cemetery built in the acid sand, with our objectives, the social and ideological changes experienced in early England. But I realised that this version of project design of the early 80s, like Binford's in the 60s and 70s, lacked an essential component which was coming to the fore, particularly in Australia and America. The social context in which our work was to take place. This was something else that Petrie knew about. He said, in archaeology, there is perhaps a greater range of ethical questions of the individual versus the community than in any other science. At Sutton Hoo, we had a wide range of stakeholders, as it becoming fashionable to call them, in the early 80s. Landowners, the government, academic historians, local people who took their dogs for a walk on the mounds. There were also the unborn, those to whom we owed something of this monument's survival. Of all those who submitted research designs for Sutton Hoo, I was the only one who drew back from the total excavation of the whole site, which thus came very close to happening. My sample excavation ran counter to the current of the day, which said that only the excavation of the whole site would tell us the answer, whatever the question was. I said that the question determined the answer, and if the question demanded the excavation of the whole site, it was the wrong question, and we should start again. I insisted on the concept of the ethical stance, and got slapped around for it from the trust. Things we would not do, in other words, because they were unethical. They deprived the unborn of their birthright. The design thus confined itself to the part we could justify and knew how to dig. The rest of the site, 75% of it, as so far known, would wait for the future. At Ashir, I encountered another kind of ethical restraint. Once we had defined the 10th century Fatimid town, the Algerian government wanted us to clear the inside, ban ploughing, and make it into a monument. This seemed crazy to me. It would have alienated every farmer on the Haut Plateau for no reason. What was ploughed, and might as well go on being ploughed. Particularly by local persons who had every reason to take care of the site and see off intruders. Strata was very dusty and needed water to improve definition, and water was in short supply. The research objective, to compare Roman and Islamic agriculture, was intriguing but sensitive. Our project team contained Francophile, Francophobe, agnostic, devout Islam and fundamentalist Islamic participants, resulting in a dialogue of impenetrable density and my eventual expulsion as a spy in 1993. Each of us had no doubt had a special mission for the past, and, well, the idea of design that I promoted was only aimed at consensus. I wasn't trying to win the argument, I was trying to reconcile the arguments. My most recent project at Port Mahon was also on sand, but a smooth, silty sand, a joy to trowel, and, sprayed with water and looked at from a tower, had a marvellous, marvellous definition. The research objectives were not controversial. We were looking for a Pictish settlement at the time their kingdom formed. But the social context was no less complex than Algeria. North East Scotland has some 42 recorded varieties of Christianity, and they all seem to have a view on what should happen to the Church of St. Colman, and indeed how the monastery beneath it had come about. We had many different sorts of funding and many partners in the venture. Some locals wanted tourism, others didn't. Some liked history, others regarded history as a personal affront. Some locals just didn't like other locals. We had a great variety of participants on site. We didn't have a Catherine Willey. We didn't need one. We found ourselves enmeshed in a permanent class struggle, not calmed by whisky. But I was older now and had a surer knack, not of arguing for what I wanted, but arguing for design which aligned what I and others wanted from our expedition with what it was possible to have, given the terrain and the social, economic and political circumstances in which we found ourselves. Here then is my potted biography, compressed into a single table. For 38 years I've been instructed and sometimes berated over the right way to do things. But I've remained convinced that there isn't one, and unlike Wheeler, I really mean it. On the contrary, there is an infinite number of right ways, provided you justify them by design. Doing field archaeology is not a matter of being right or wrong, but of being appropriate. What is done in the field cannot proceed from a theory and must not rely on a single method. This is not because archaeology is an art rather than a science, but because it is an art and a science and a social science. It is a historical pursuit deploying scientific procedures in a social arena. The way this is achieved, as it is in architecture, sculpture, novel writing, building a motorway or going to the moon, is by design. There's no trick here and no dogma, design is different for every project, and all method and theory are subsumed in the design process. In my way of thinking, what you do in the field depends on the research agenda, the terrain, and the social context in which you work. What you want to know, what you can know, and what you're permitted to investigate at any particular place and time. These things must be discovered during a preliminary stage, the evaluation stage, and then matched to each other in the form of a design. In this talk, we've observed that the objectives of those who sally forth into the field can be distinguished as between art and science, history and process, human and biological views of the world. These warring ideas may be present in the same person. Art and science, curiosity about people, and an analytical method of inquiry are both necessary for our mission, so they are both necessary to our execution of the mission. In this, we resemble neither chemistry nor humanitarian intuition, but make use of both, like medicine. Our objectives will include the big picture, the community and its culture, what happened to them, and why, and what made them change, and the small pictures. How did these people relate to each other, the landscape, their past? Clearly, these objectives will not surrender to a single technique. Our raw materials are amazingly varied. The stuff we work on can be rock, marsh or field. We can encounter strata on top of a mountain or under the sea, a big wide world of different terrain. This geographic and geological circumstance provides field archaeology's arena. Whatever we want to know, the terrain is determinant of what we can see and the means we will need to see it. As I show in Lecture 2, we have enlarged what we expect from excavation from a few interfaces in a section to variations in the smallest grains of minerals and into the molecules beyond that. Our work takes place out of doors, on land, in public and for the public. It is deeply embedded in society. People care what we find, for ill or good. Some are reluctant to have their time on earth interrupted with bad news from the country of the dead. The past is an irrelevance and an impedance, and archaeologists are a pain. Others feel that the land of the dead is their land and lay claim to it. Doing good field work requires money. Who is to pay and why? All these matters, also determinant for what is done, come from the social context of the field worker. In our team, in our locality, in our country, and on our continent, we are in a social, political and economic situation which determines what field archaeologists can do. This applies too to those who confront archaeology's version of the past and believe that the vision of their tradition or their faith is equally valid. Part of the success of the postmodern platform comes from the realization that just as science challenged religion in the 19th century, so religion is challenging science in the late 20th. An estimated 80% of the world's population subscribe to faiths that the remaining 20% would regard as irrational. And these latter naturally prefer to rationalize the rights of the irrational rather than fight them. One sensible response is to accept that religion does not have the monopoly on ethics, something I just heard the Archbishop of Canterbury, Mona Siddiqui, David Baddiel and Philip Pullman all accept as common ground. If this is so, we don't need to soften our deductive desires to avoid giving offence. We need to harden our ethical framework as it applies to archaeology, to protect the interests of our fellows, to make new knowledge while doing no harm. Here I'm going to take ethics as the foundation of archaeology's social context, which is the subject of my lecture 3. Objective, terrain, social context. What we want to know, out of what remains, out of what we can access. This is what makes field archaeology happen and explains why it is different every time and every place. Those that don't want it to be this varied urge us to go for the box, for the random test pit, for the stratigraphic context, procedures in which we feel safe. But I'm hoping to persuade you that those days are gone. Research agenda, terrain and social context must be assessed every time by evaluation and reconciled through design and implemented with the largest possible toolbox in which nothing is forbidden. This isn't anarchy, but strength. Doing field archaeology is team creativity, like making a film. But unlike making a film, you only get one take. Detailed preparation is essential. Design is all. All theoretical and all practical options are subsumed in the design process. Everything is allowed. Every voice must be heard up to the moment of decision. But once the decision is agreed, we must stick to it, because we have formed a social contract, in this case with the unborn. This is the message I hope to leave you with at the end of Saturday. When we go on a world tour on Sunday, it will be to emphasise the variety of terrain and social context, and in consequence, the designs that people come up with. Nevertheless, I also want to ask the question, is archaeology a global project? And if so, should it become a single discipline that looks the same everywhere you encounter it? Then we will come back home and take a look at ourselves. Because if these lectures succeed in their aim of advocating a new, creative, value-led, dogma-free kind of fieldwork, it has a very good chance, I think, of being pioneered here in Scotland.